like to start immediately with Scripture. If you would turn to Romans chapter 8. And we're just going to read a couple of verses here at the beginning. Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 20. We read there in Romans 8 and verse 20, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." Liberty, freedom. That's what God intends to deliver to all of us, but also really to the whole world. And more than the world when we think of world, because we live in a space age, the entirety of creation, the entire universe, God plans on bringing liberty to that, freedom to all of that. Liberty and freedom is at the very heart of God's own plan for all of existence. And I wasn't here. We were out of town up in the Northeast Family Weekend, which, by the way, greetings to everyone from everyone there in the Northeast who are at the weekend. They all express their love and fondness for those in Charlotte and for everything that happens here. And so I wasn't here, but I know y'all probably had messages quite akin to what we had, talking about Israel coming through the Red Sea at the end of the days as they were leaving Egypt behind, a picture of sin, and going forward. And after the Red Sea collapsed on all of the enemies that were pursuing them, really the greatest nation in the world by many accounts, they were truly a free people, right? At the end of all of that, at the end of the days we've just pictured, what was left? Israel as a free people. You know, sometimes in the U.S. we'll say that this is the freest nation that's ever existed. I would dare say Israel at that moment was freer. Because it wasn't just their own strength of arm that was able to protect them from their enemies. It was actually God, the Creator, who crushed the greatest nation in the world for them to be free, and who promised to be their benefactor and their protector. They were truly a free people. But what did they do with that freedom? In fact, what does it actually mean to be free? What does freedom actually mean? What does liberty actually mean? It's not as easy to understand as we can give it credit for, and part of that is because, at least for myself and many in our audience, though not all of them, though as we'll talk about it, we're all affected by it, America has its own idea of what freedom is. It's a very particular idea, and the country was founded on a very particular idea of freedom. It's kind of woven into our DNA. But is it actual freedom? Is it actual liberty? Today we want to talk about that. We want to explore this idea of freedom. We want to make sure that we see freedom and liberty the way that God sees freedom and liberty. Because as we will see, it is central to life as a Christian. And it's at the very beating heart of what God intends to do with all of us in giving us eternal life. So the title today is Understanding True Liberty and Freedom. Understanding True Liberty and Freedom. So before we look at God's view, I would like to take what might seem a disproportionately large amount of time looking at America's view of freedom. And that's for cause. Like I mentioned in the announcements, the United States, in a very real way, was founded on a concept of freedom that was very new in the world and has been credited with expanding more freedom into the world than really any sense of liberty or freedom that had been in place before that. And as I'm an American, and at least here in the audience, our relatively small audience, I'm speaking to Americans, but they're streaming. You know, we have Americans, but a mixture of non-Americans. We'll talk about that as well. If you are an American, then you have been drenched in concepts of freedom really virtually since birth. I would even say since conceptions. So if you heard anything from the womb, you know, outside your mother, then it would have involved a picture of freedom that is very American and is relatively modern in the world, as we'll discuss. Modern as in the last 400, 500 years or so. especially in the last couple of hundred years when the country was founded. And we've heard discussions of freedom and liberty, and we continue to hear it, right? Both on the right and the left. Today is it might sound like a politics-related message, and it's not. And we'll talk about the temptation to think of it that way when it's not, because both on the right and the left, you talk about freedom and liberty and what that means, and of course everyone's at each other's throat. Is that because of a loss of freedom? Well, we'll find out that's actually not the case. For those of us who are Americans, we have a very particular sense of what freedom is, defined by some of the most secularly sacred documents in our culture, in our history, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution to a certain extent. And we can take it for granted. I know for myself, when I hear the words freedom or liberty, I tend to very instinctively think certain ideas that are rooted in concepts that have been programmed into me as an American. It's just, I don't even have to call back and go, no, what is the idea of freedom? No, I instinctively think certain things. And when I hear on the news about things encroaching on our freedoms, I think of freedom in the way that a lot of Americans would. It's like the old philosophical discussion that, you know who doesn't tend to think about water a lot? Fish. It's the medium in which they know their entire existence. To a certain extent, it surrounds them and is more important to them than it is to any other creature on earth, and yet they don't think about it much because it is that pervasive. And so same thing as an American. We can take for granted what freedom and liberty is because we, like fish, have been swimming in the most radical idea of freedom that has existed in world history to a great extent for our entire lives. And so it's important for us to make sure we know what freedom actually is. That is the way that God actually sees it. But it's also important for all of those who happen to be watching who are not Americans. Because whether you like it or not, the American idea of freedom and liberty affects you greatly. It is being shipped and exported to you through whatever means it can be. Sometimes that's the soft exportation from culture and from media and from entertainment. And sometimes it's straight up through legislation here or presidential action. So many presidents, it's not just on both sides of the aisle, whether it's Republican, whether it's Democrat, they have had policies in place to try to export a certain flavor of freedom to other countries, to support American-style freedom in different countries, and American money talks. And so you see it having an influence in various parts of the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it affects all of us. So, in fact, in America, they've tried to instill a desire for American-style freedom in other countries in the hope that the people will get a taste of that and think, you know what, that is what I want. I want something more than the life that my leaders or religious clerics and those have given me. I want that kind of freedom. And so whether or not we're actually in America, it affects all of us. And so we want to reset our minds. But it helps as fish swimming in freedom our whole lives to take the time to try to think about it. What is this that we're enjoying? What is actual American freedom? And to do that, we're going to go all the way back to the founding of the country. Because some people think, oh no, we've lost sight of what freedom actually is. We see freedoms being taken away right and left. Well, let's ignore that for a second and go back to when the nation was founded. 1776, around there, in terms of the principles that were installed. And I'm going to call that collection of ideas, I didn't make it up, it's what it's called, liberalism. We're going to go back and take a look at liberalism. Now, the challenge today is the word liberal is a very charged word. If you're conservative, you see it as something negative. If you're on the left, you could say liberal, you see it as something positive, and it means something to you. But that's not what we're talking about. In fact, don't think of what too many today will call a liberal. Think of that more as progressivism, if you will. Beyond conservative and liberal, there is liberalism. In fact, I tried to grab a definition from the Oxford reference. You might think, why are you going to the British to understand? Anyway, they get it right. So let's we'll give the British a pass here. This Oxford reference online defines liberalism as the following: a political ideology centered upon the individual, thought of as possessing rights against the government. That is, the individual has rights that the government does not have the right to infringe upon, including, for instance, rights of due process under the law, equality of respect, freedom of expression and action, and freedom from religious and ideological constraint. So when I say liberalism, that's what I mean. And it's something that both on the right and left, in terms of politics, you'll see people generally agreeing to, for the most part. Also on the right and left, you see some people starting to question some of those freedoms, while each side accuses the other of being the one that's mainly questioning. We'll talk about that a touch in a moment. But when I say liberalism, I'm referring to this liberalism. This is the kind of liberalism in terms of freedom and liberty that was advocated by George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Benjamin Franklin. All the names that we expect to hear as we talk about classic American history back in the 18th century when the country started. They saw liberalism as an opportunity to make men free from tyranny. Men who are free to make their own choices according to their own consciences. And that the narrow purpose of government in liberalism is merely to ensure, protect, and expand that freedom. Trying to help find that balance where as you're maximizing the freedom for one, you're also maximizing the freedom for everyone else, which is very difficult. So that's how they saw liberalism. And they saw liberty and freedom as essentially the ability to be as minimally restricted as possible for society to exist while you can act according to your own conscience. You can pursue your own desires. In fact, one of the best ways to capture what was thought of as liberalism and freedom is right there at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. Let's take a look at the Declaration of Independence. So get out your copy of... You don't have a copy? What kind of American are you? It should be right there in your coat pocket. I'm just kidding, I don't either, but I have one here on my iPad. So this is from the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And if you are an American, hopefully it resonates with you in some way. Given the status of our history classes these days, it may not. But here is something very early, the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. What was written there as America declared its independence from Britain? The following statement: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." You can boil down a vast amount of what America is and what America stands for to that single statement. And we might wonder where that came from. Where is that found in the Bible? It's not found in the Bible. They were not founding America on the Bible. They were influenced by the Bible. They were a mixture of people of different Protestant sort of faiths, some of them of kind of a deist nature faith, some of them hardcore Protestant faiths. But they were not founding it on the Bible because that was actually contrary to the principle. They didn't want to found a country that was pressing its ideas on anyone. They wanted a country where people were free to pursue according to their conscience with no particular priority. Some of the major influences on the founders were a variety of philosophers from 100 to 200 or so years before them. For instance, just a list of examples: Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Montesquieu. Those four being a mixture of a couple of French and a couple of English philosophers who were highly influential. In fact, that preamble, that first part there of the Declaration of Independence, some of those statements are virtual quotes from some of these men. These were incredibly influential thinkers, and over the course of their careers and others, they developed radically new ideas of liberty. That's why you see at the beginning, unlike the Bible's focus on obligations to our fellow man, the Declaration of Independence focused on rather the rights of every individual man. What is the right? What are the rights of each of us? And of course, anytime you say something like, unlike the Bible's focus on blank, you're setting up a contrast that's going to be a bad sign of some sort. And when I say these things, as I highlight, I'm not trying to knock the founding fathers of the United States. If you really look into their lives, they were tremendous. Generally, not only men of character and integrity, but also wise and well-read and truly trying to create a nation in the world where people could be the most free they've ever been and would try to put off tyranny as far as they could. Even the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative and the judicial, and making them not in one body but separated and competing, frankly, with checks and balances against each other. That comes from the philosopher Montesquieu, the French philosopher, trying to prevent a tyranny by giving no one all the power, but splitting it up and making them check and balance each other by dividing it all. Now, of course, in the Bible, what does Jesus Christ tell us about a house that's divided against itself? It's not a good formula, right? However, you understand where they were coming from, because they were trying to create not a theological empire, but an empire where somehow humans could govern themselves. And so they did that by purposefully dividing the government based on Montesquieu's ideas to try to create this. Every government in the world has had those functions: the executive function, the legislative function, the judicial function. Adolf Hitler had all three. Caesar Augustus had all three. But they, in their wisdom, a carnal wisdom, but a wisdom, said, look, anytime these things are aggregated, someone gets too powerful, let's try to split it up. To try to do what? To prevent a tyranny that might begin to remove these freedoms. And so these philosophers had a huge impact. They had an idea of freedom and liberty that was quite a contrast to the old world. If you look at how things used to be. Some examples. In the past, in some countries, a lot of land was owned by royalty. In fact, I know there's a tale even in England right now where it's kind of a problem. I could be getting it wrong, and any viewers who might be seeing this later in England might know the tale, but my understanding is it's a long-held family house, and they just found that part of what they thought was their land is actually the king's land. It's actually a tiny bit, but not a tiny bit. My understanding is it's actually significant for them, and so it's like, well, they don't have the rights to that anymore, and it's about to be removed. It's like, oh, does the king really need it? But laws are law. What are they going to do, right? Well, the idea that you can have land that is just yours, and then be free to do with it. It doesn't have to stay with you. What if you decide, I don't want land, and you want to sell it all? Well, then you should be free to do this. The idea that there's not some royalty or aristocracy that is above everyone, that has rights that the others don't have, but the idea that people are actually equal in that sense. Often in the old world, your future and present was determined by your ancestry. If your grandfather was a horse thief, it's like, there's so-and-so, the horse thieving family. And how do you escape that? Because some of those decisions were generational. Maybe you're serving off the loan to the king or someone else that your great-great-grandpappy had actually sort of set up. And the idea that no one should be a prisoner of accidents of birth. That was part of their idea. That just because you were born into a certain circumstance, you should be able to break those bonds and be free of that, free of the decisions of your parents, free of the decisions of your grandparents, to be able to truly shape your way in the world. We're truly at liberty. The idea of not working for a lord or a lady so much, but the freedom to work for yourself, where everything you earn is really yours. Ideas like that. The idea of a state that doesn't have the power to impose a religion on you or to impose upon your conscience something the state feels is right or wrong. These ideas didn't just begin with the founding fathers. They began with these philosophers, some of whom were also religious men themselves, but didn't feel religion belonged in government. Because the moment you kind of bring religion in government, well, now you are imposing something on others' consciences. And real freedom means being able to pursue according to your conscience, freedom of conscience. If someone in their minds isn't actually free to pursue according to his own conscience, then how is he actually free? Many of these philosophers worked hard to try to say that, no tradition should go unexamined, no custom should go unexamined, and no one should be imprisoned by customs and traditions that the whole community doesn't even want anymore. The community should be free to get together to make a social contract that here's how we want to live. Here's what we want to do. Here's what we believe is right or wrong. That idea of the social contract was fundamental coming out of the ideas of these philosophers and being pursued in America. America represented a place where you had inherent individual rights, unattached to your homeland, unattached to your forefathers, unattached to your parents, but you, as a living, breathing individual, had these rights. And that was rare in the world. And here's an entirely new country devoted to that principle, that you, not just because of your parents or your children or your lineage, that you as an individual would have the inherent fundamental right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You able to pursue your happiness. They thought of liberty as a condition that you had when there were no external or accidental restrictions placed upon you other than the minimum necessary to preserve that freedom. This was a real change from the past, like I mentioned, and I want to quote from a book. It's funny, I was going to have to show you these covers on my iPad, but since we're meeting here at the office, I could literally go in my office and get the book. This book, actually by Patrick Deneen, is his name, and Deneen is spelled D-E-N-E-E-N. And it's titled, Why Liberalism Failed. He is a conservative writer himself, and it is actually astonishing. I've really appreciated it. He doesn't know the solutions to the problems he finds, and they vex him. He's got actually a new book that's out where he's trying to offer some solutions. But he's a huge, I say fan, he's actually a scholar, but I'd say a scholar and probably a fan, given that he's chosen to study a lot of Alexis de Tocqueville. The French intellectual that came to take a look at American penal system and actually looked at the entire system and wrote Democracy in America, quite an influential book. In a lot of ways, I think Tocqueville was, I don't mean prophetic in terms of God guiding him, but he said things, it's astonishing to see them actually coming true. Because there are things he admired about America, but he also saw fatal flaws in the American conception of liberty and freedom. And some of the things he said are literally so many decades later, the things we're actually seeing coming to pass. Well, anyway, Patrick Deneen wrote this book, Why Liberalism Failed. And this is a quote from this. He says, liberty is a word of ancient lineage, yet liberalism, this philosophy we're discussing, has a more recent pedigree, being arguably only a few hundred years old. It arises from a redefinition of the nature of liberty to mean almost the opposite of its original meaning. And he says, by ancient and Christian understandings, and that's Christian as he understands it, but he actually is getting a lot of this right. He says liberty, by these ancient understandings, liberty was the condition of self-governance, whether achieved by the individual or by a political community, was the condition of self-governance. He says, because self-rule was achieved only with difficulty, requiring an extensive habituation in virtue, particularly self-command and self-discipline over base but insistent appetites, the achievement of liberty required constraints upon individual choice. This limitation was achieved not primarily by promulgated law, though law had its place, but through extensive social norms in the form of custom. He says liberalism, on the other hand, reconceives liberty as the opposite of this older conception. It is understood to be the greatest possible freedom from external constraints, including customary norms. The only limitation on liberty in this view should be duly enacted laws consistent with maintaining order of otherwise unfettered individuals. And it's that latter freedom and liberty that we have long enjoyed in the United States. And it is that freedom and liberty that is tearing the country apart. Because as we'll see, it's not God's idea of freedom and liberty. we are living in a world that's falling apart. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but if not, run to a window. We are living in a country that actually is falling apart in many ways. A lot of us are talking about how do we write scripts for telecasts that are going to air after the next election when we don't even know what percentage of the country is going to be on fire after the next election. It's hard to do that. We might end up rewriting programs because we just find that they're not quite as applicable. Let me refer to Deneen again, because Deneen highlights it's very easy to think our country's falling apart because we're losing our freedom. We're losing our liberty. But what Deneen highlights so well in his book, the case he makes, is that it's the opposite of that. What the country is experiencing is finally the full bloom of the philosophies on which it was founded more than 200 years ago. He writes in his book, perhaps above all, liberalism has drawn down on a pre-liberal inheritance. That is, the people that tried to establish these foundations were themselves individuals of higher integrity, and they actively didn't want to work into the system something that would actively maintain that integrity, because people need freedom to maintain their faith as they understand it, their traditions as they want them to be. But as a result, it's like having a bank account that you continue to draw out of but don't replenish. So again, to continue what he says, perhaps above all, liberalism has drawn down on a pre-liberal inheritance and resources that at once sustained liberalism, but which it cannot replenish. The loosening of social bonds in nearly every aspect of life, familial, neighborly, communal, religious, and even national, reflects the advancing logic of liberalism and is the source of its deepest instability. It's like the old, who's the cartoon character? Pogo? Is it? I want to get him right. Anyone old enough here in this room of really young people to know? Oh boy, it's disappointing. Well, anyway, there was a cartoon character famous for noting, we have met the enemy and he is us. So that's kind of what he's saying, is that this is actually the end result of these philosophies. And if you go back and look at Thomas Hobbes, you look at John Locke, you look at their writings, you'll actually see how consistent it is with these things. For instance, consider we just heard on the telecast from Mr. Weston, the deterioration of the family structure. Well, part of their idea was freedom from involuntary ties. Who should have to inherit obligations, right? We should be free to forge our own path and obligations. Look at rampant homosexuality. Well, again, freedom from external constraints, freedom from customary norms and roles. Even transgenderism is still a part of that. And now, if you're paying attention, I don't know if you're paying attention, I hope you are. I can go back, because I'm an old fella, I've read things, that back when conservatives were far stronger about arguing against the spread of homosexuality, against the idea of same-sex marriage. It should never be said without quote marks, because it's not a marriage. God defines marriage. And now I see so many conservatives, if you will, not trying to change homosexual marriage. Why? Because that's liberty. Someone should have the freedom to do what they want. They should have the freedom to marry who they want. And really, again, if you look at our founding documents, what is in there? What is in the Declaration of Independence? What is in the Constitution of our country that would ever push back against some of those things? Also, part of what we see today, morality being defined only by what the community decides to make legal or illegal. Again, part of the fundamental philosophies of the country. This is part of the idea of the social contract, that a people should have the freedom to decide what they want to allow and not allow, and not have that imposed upon them from the outside. There is biblical precedent, I do believe, in terms of what we're seeing in America currently. Let's turn to the book of Judges. And spoiler alert, anytime someone says, let's look at a precedent for today, let's look at the book of Judges, that is almost always a bad sign. In fact, we're going to go to the end of the story, because turn to Judges 19. Because the time of the Judges reflects the period after they've left the Red Sea, and it reflects several centuries where they were the freest people on planet Earth. While Moses was alive during the wanderings, they were generally faithful. They grumbled, but were faithful for the most part. As the generation passed, and the next generation rose up. And it says under Joshua they were faithful. And under the elders who lived at the same time as Joshua, there was a certain faithfulness. But those things don't last forever. And the Judges gives us a time when there were no real institutions in place. As it continues to say, there was no king. There was no institution in place to truly enforce the laws. God had told them what to do. If someone's committing adultery, you need to stone them to death. If this is happening, you need to do this. But to a certain extent, they were at liberty as to whether they were really going to do those things or not, very fully. I mean, yes, there was the tabernacle in Shiloh, but you know what? Shiloh is a long way away, right? So you really kind of had a real freedom there. And what did it accumulate to? We have one of the worst stories starting in Judges 19. Start in Judges 19 in verse 1. We read there, and it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel. Again, we're constantly told there was no one to enforce the morality on the people. It says there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah. And he was there 4 whole months. Then her husband arose, went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having his servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. So I won't go into all those details, but here's where we're starting. So we have a Levite, so amongst that tribe that's been set apart by God for holy purposes, and his woman is cheating on him and running around, and he goes, he tries to bring her back, and who knows why she was, who knows what kind of guy he was. Actually, I think later on we see what kind of guy he was. This was not, these were not the Married Couple of the Year award recipients when you actually get more details. Let's jump down to verse 14. Judges chapter 19 and verse 14. It says here, and they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. They turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gibeah, and when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. So that's a big deal for God, by the way, hospitality. God expects his people to be hospitable, and here they are, and no one's actually willing to shelter them for the night. So they're just going to spend the night in the open city. They've got provisions, he says. They've got stuff they need for their animals, so they're just going to spend the night in the open square. But it says in verse 16, just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who was also from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. So he comes and he sees them there, and he is very concerned. He talks to them and asks them where they're from, and they tell him, we're just planning on spending the night here. In verse 20, we see his reaction to that. The old man says to them in verse 20, he says, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square. He knows that is not going to go well for them. And it should start to sound a little familiar with another story that happens earlier in Genesis. If not, it will as it goes on. Verse 21, so he brought them into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. And then verse 22, as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came to your house that we might know him carnally. Now, what does that sound like to you? A roving band of raping homosexuals or bisexuals coming to the house, pounding on the door, asking for the man that came into town because they want to know him carnally. Now, in the Old King James, it says just know him, but it's in the sense that Adam knew Eve. It's the New King James elaborates for cause. Doesn't that sound like Sodom and Gomorrah? Isn't that what you read earlier, what happened in Genesis when the angels came to Lot? The same circumstance. We go in the course of just say 400 or 500 years or so, in fact, maybe less, 3 or 4 actually, if you look at the timeline, about 300 or 400 years, you go from essentially Joshua, who with the people had heard the voice of God, as a leader who'd heard the voice of God himself on Mount Sinai, as close to the law as they could possibly get, over the course of 3 or 4 centuries, descending into becoming Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, let's go ahead and get the rest of the story. It says in verse 23, but the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brethren, I beg you, do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage. Look, here's my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing. So this is the solution that he comes up with to solve this particular problem. So verse 25, it says, but the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine, this is the Levite, and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning. And when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was till it was light. So jump down to verse 28. It's the next morning. And the Levite comes out. He says, and he said to her, well, get up and let's be going. That is just so terrible to the point that you want to laugh. Not that it's funny, but that how can it be such a bizarro, upside-down world in Israel that it had come to a place like this? And he says in verse 28, but there was no answer. The general understanding is that she was dead. Some question whether she was dead, perhaps, but I think that is the best understanding of this. It says, so the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. And let's just jump to the next chapter to get a question at the time. As they're looking at all of this, it's like, well, how could this happen? And we get down to verse 23. Chapter 20 and verse 3. It says, now the children of Benjamin heard the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And it says, the children of Israel said, tell us, how did this wicked deed happen? And it just reminds, I'm not saying they're kind of asking specifically. And then the Levite tells his story, which personally I suspect he kind of colored it in the direction that makes him look better. But regardless, he tells the story. And it reminds me of what's going on today. How many times do we see scenes from a drag queen story hour? Or we see these things where they have drag shows for children, where children are putting money into their clothes and things like that. When we see homosexual pride parades in all these different places. We see, frankly, the wealthy getting away in many cases with whatever they want in court, and your success in court often being determined by being able to afford the best lawyers. All the different ways in which our society is crumbling and falling apart. What are we saying? How could it get like this? How is this possible? Well, how did it get like that? It didn't happen the day before. It wasn't like everyone was meeting together and worshiping God properly the day before and then this happened. It was a long corruption over years until things are finally so bad. Someone says, how could this possibly happen? Well, it's actually not a mystery because God answers the question in the book of Judges. Go to the last chapter of the book of Judges and the last verse. We read there in the last chapter and the last verse, in those days, this is Judges 21 and verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now understand, it didn't just say everyone did what was wrong in his own eyes. He did what he thought was right. Everyone followed their conscience. Everyone considered what they thought was right as an individual and then pursued that course of action. Isn't that statement, the freedom to follow what is right in your own eyes, akin to what America has set up as American flavored freedom? Everyone free to do what's right in their eyes, to pursue happiness as what's happy for them, what happiness is for them. If it's happiness as the king determines happiness, do you think that's what the founding fathers were wanting to do? Well, you're free to pursue happiness and we will tell you what makes you happy. It's the opposite of what they were trying to achieve. Many have highlighted, Patrick Deneen highlighted, and John Adams highlighted, actually Tocqueville highlights that there was a certain quality of person at the beginning. The religions were important in America at the time. They were generally a more religious people than you would find most anywhere on the face of the earth in terms of especially those particular flavors of Christianity. But at the same time, think about that. Well, only if they just remained faithful to their religion. If you really look into why the founding fathers and the philosophers that supported them didn't want to weave religion into the government, if you want to look at why John Adams and George Washington agreed that America was not founded in any way as a Christian nation, that is their words in the Treaty of Tripoli, it's not mine. It was because they saw in religion, just like the philosophers of the time did, religion was a source of sectarianism, infighting, and division. They saw it in Europe all the time. When someone thinks the Eucharist, the Christ is that's actually his body and blood. No, it's not his body and blood, but he is present in it. But it's not his body and blood. Oh, let's kill each other. They just saw all of that division constantly, and they said, that's not reason. That's not rational. People need to be free to pursue their faith as they see fit. And so now they were actively, many of them, pursuing their faith, but even then, what was the faith they pursued? Was it true Christianity? No, it was the various flavors of Christianity that each of the harlot daughters of Revelation taught. It was not, there was one of the sayings I heard, I think it's correct, I've heard it from good sources, but I've never checked on it, that one of the battle cries during the American Revolution was, "No king but Jesus." No king but Jesus. Oh, it sounds good. I got to admit, it stirs a little masculine energy. I mean, it said, "No king but Jesus." But what Jesus were they talking about? Actually Jesus Christ that we know, or was it what Paul described as another Jesus? It was the other Jesus. They weren't even all the same other Jesuses. There were various religions depicted on keeping 8 of the 10 commandments or 9 of the 10 commandments. In fact, most all their faiths, one of the core beliefs is that religion would pick and choose amongst God's commandments. And we can only leave out one commandment. And the spirit of leaving that out, the spirit of picking and choosing is enough to corrupt us. It's interesting. I wish I still had all my teeth. If you're young, and we have some young people here present, take care of your teeth. If mom and dad get on you about brushing your teeth, they're right. So make sure you do it. I did brush my teeth. I don't know if I did it well enough, but anyway, I've lost more teeth than I wish. These are all my teeth. But I've been crowned with many crowns over the course of my life. So, and the last one, it was, I also regrettably clenched my teeth. So I have a guard. I had one in the past, I didn't use it. So guess what? Things didn't go well. And sure enough, I lost a molar here. And at first, it was clearly an infection, and so the idea was, well, I'll just get a root canal. I've had so many. So I went into a specialist, because I always have to go to a specialist because my roots like to do loop-de-loops or something. So I was there at the specialist, and he's doing the root canal, and he notices something. And he's in the tooth. He's got all the equipment. He can see, and it's magnified. He says, "Ooh, I have bad news. I'll do a root canal if you want me to, but it won't last you more than a couple years, maybe 3 or 4. Because there are microfractures." "You grind your teeth?" "Yes, I do." He says, "Well, there's little microfractures. You can't see them in an x-ray, but he could see them with his lenses and equipment." And he said they're incredibly small, but they're just big enough to allow bacteria. And he says, "I can go ahead and do this root canal. We can put the filling in. We can put the crown on, but it won't last because the 1 or 2 bacteria in there eventually will become 2 to 4 bacteria, or 4 to 8 bacteria. It's only a matter of time." And I said, "Well, I can't afford an implant. We're getting pretty close to my smile. We're not there yet." But I have been told by the dentist, yes, I do need to get an implant, because otherwise your jaw wears down and I'm always chewing more on one side. You don't need my dental details. But anyway, I said, "Look, I can't afford an implant. That's costly. So let's just go ahead and do the root canal, and I'll pray God gives it more time." And actually, I don't think he said 2 to 4. I think he said 2 years. And it did last 4. But it was inevitable. And you know what? Taking out 1 of the 10 commandments is far more than a microfracture in God's law. The spirit willing to do that is not a spirit that can actually maintain the faith it needs to bind a people together. And even if it were, the American government is purposefully designed not to maintain our faiths. It's meant to give us freedom. In fact, the very same freedom that allows people to come to. Imagine if someone couldn't change churches and come to our church because, well, our state law says I have to remain Episcopalian, right? But yet it's that same freedom that we have that all sorts of other terrible things enjoy in this world. No, if we're going to understand real freedom, we have to look at it how God sees it. And it is important. In fact, this is one of my favorite statements in the Bible, John chapter 8. Let's take a look and see just how important it is for Christians to understand freedom. John chapter 8. In John chapter 8, we have this statement by Jesus Christ, and he says, and we'll actually set a bit of context here, even though it kind of gets us a little bit ahead. He says in John 8 and verse 34, we'll start in verse 34, but we'll actually be going to verse 36. John chapter 8 and verse 34, Jesus answered them, "Most assuredly, I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." Oh, it's beautiful language there. That if Jesus Christ, if the Son of God makes you free, then you shall be free indeed. In fact, let me kind of back up on earlier statements. Some say that America is the freest nation in the world. I've said, well, I think Israel was the freest nation in the world. But truly, if we're not worried about political boundaries, the freest people in the world are the church of God. The body of Christ is literally the freest people in the world. And that is a freedom that actually is independent of our physical circumstances. If we're actually physically slaves of another, if we're rotting away in the prison of some guerrilla warriors or something, every living, breathing Christian alive today who is a true Christian is utterly free according to the true definition of freedom, because Jesus Christ promises if the Son makes you free, then you shall be free indeed. In fact, another great poetic statement that's kind of missed in the New King James a little bit is in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1. We read here in Galatians 5 and verse 1, Paul says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage." Now, actually, I want to read this instead, because there's some wordplay that's here in the Greek that doesn't come across the New King James very well. I want to read this in the English Standard Version, the ESV. And in Galatians 5 and verse 1, in the ESV, it says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." The Greek word there is the same for both. The New King James used a different word for freedom the first time and then free, even though in the Greek it's the same. For freedom, Christ has set us free. We are destined for freedom. We are free now, and we are destined for the ultimate freedom. And so it behooves us to understand, what does that mean then? Still, what is freedom? American freedom has, over the course of 200 years, produced a country increasingly in slavery. It doesn't seem like it. I mean, in an actual dictatorship, how many of those kids on college campuses today, how many student protests do you think there were under Stalin? Right? How many student protests do you think there were under Hitler? It's like, oh, what are we going to do? We can't arrest everybody. Oh, wait, yeah, I can. I'm Hitler, right? They would just arrest everybody, and that would be it. So in terms of physical circumstances, we are an incredibly free country in America. And yet, when it comes to sin, real lack of freedom is what dominates the day. We are not actually a free people. We are increasingly, voluntarily steeped in slavery. There's an irony when we understand real freedom. The freedom of the world produces slavery, but slavery to God produces real freedom. So what is real freedom? Real freedom is the ability to live free from the slavery of sin and to make oneself a slave to God. Because the fact is, we will serve someone. We will serve a master. And for those that haven't been freed by Jesus Christ, they don't have a choice. That master is the devil. They don't really know it all the time. But if they're deceived, then it is. Revelation 12:9, the devil's deceived the whole world. That serpent has. But we've been freed. We celebrated that. The Passover, in the days of unleavened bread, we've been freed. But we still have a choice. Do I want to be a bond slave to God and Jesus Christ, or do I want to be a bond slave to Satan the devil? If we think there's an in-between, well, I just want to be my own man. Well, then welcome to your slavery to the devil. Let's make sure we understand this. One of the great characterizations of sin we see in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis 4, when God is trying to make plain the nature of sin to Cain. In Genesis chapter 4, we had the situation where Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve, have offered their offerings, and Abel's has been accepted, Cain's has been rejected. And it's not because God is capricious. We don't know all the details, and we could speculate about certain details. Actually, there's a lot of good ideas. All we know is that Cain himself was not doing it right. God says as much. But God wanted the best for Cain and talked to him and tried to explain things. So we see in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 6. Genesis 4 and verse 6. So the Eternal said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? Why do you have that look on your face? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." That picture of its desire being for you, that desire is a powerful word. It's the same word used of woman, how your desire will be for your husband. It's pictured here like an animal lying at the door just waiting to see him, to pounce upon him and to take him. I saw a real-life version of that at the zoo once in Kansas City. We were walking by I think it was the cheetah's pen. And thankfully, it was one of those where they weren't behind bars, but there was a large ditch between the animal and then us, and then thankfully a glass barrier all the more in addition to the ditch. And it wasn't any of our kids who were also little, but there was a little girl, I would say maybe 6 or 7, maybe as young as 4. It's vague. I just know she was very little, but could walk on her own. She was following her parents, but separate enough from them that there was no question as to the focus. And I saw a cheetah see that girl and crouch to the ground and square its shoulders. And I've seen my cat do it 100 times. It's like that cheetah was thinking, there is a meal, and I'm going to eat it. And then you saw the cheetah kind of relax, like, oh yeah, I'm in a zoo. It wasn't, maybe it was new to the zoo. And the other cheetah's like, you need to get that out of your system. You're just going to stress yourself out. You don't get to eat any of the food that's walking around. But boy, did that animal want to. And that's how sin is described here, as having a desire for us to sink its claws into us. Sin always enslaves. Always. We cannot get away with a tiny sin and not have a bit of shackles placed on us. It is the nature of sin to do that. It's the nature of sin to do that. It always enslaves. Real freedom means getting away from sin. Choosing not to have sin as a master, but God and Jesus Christ as our masters. Paul discusses this in great detail in Romans chapter 6. We'll turn to Romans chapter 6, but as you're turning there, let me comment a bit on Romans chapter 7. We're not going to turn to Romans chapter 7, but I encourage you to read it. I appreciate the transparency of the Apostle Paul in writing Romans chapter 7. He clearly indicates he is familiar with the slavery of sin. He despairs that even as he loves God's law in his mind, he says in Romans 7 that he still sees the members of his body occasionally serving the master of sin. Like the old man has been pronounced dead, and yet still it lingers. Still the fact of that death sentence is being lived out as he mortifies the deeds of the flesh. And it shows up every once in a while, and it just frustrates him. It frustrates him because he wants to live a purely godly life, and yet it just keeps coming back here and there. Even as he advances, it's never done, right? It's always a struggle. And I just greatly appreciate Romans 7 and then Romans 8 for talking about that. If you have not seen Mr. Rod King's sermon on the third law, he addresses it so beautifully. So Paul knew what he was talking about. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 12, Romans 6 and verse 12, he says, "Therefore do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lusts. And do not present yourselves as instruments of unrighteousness to sin, but present yourselves to God as being alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." That is, not under the death penalty. If we all see ourselves as doomed because we've fallen short of the law, well then let's just eat, drink, and be merry. We're going to die anyway. We've been freed from the death penalty of the law and freed to actually keep it. The law doesn't simply just tell us where we've fallen short. It becomes a goal that we can reach for with the help of God's Spirit. Let's actually continue to verse 16. Let's look at verse 16. He tells us all, "Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves as slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness? But God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. And having been set free from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." He says, "I speak in human terms," verse 19, "because of the weakness of your flesh." Because he probably understands the end of verse 18. Sometimes you say something as a speaker or writer, and you realize, okay, that probably caught you off guard. He talks about, "You're slaves of righteousness." He says, look, I'm speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. "For just as you presented your members as slaves of uncleanness and of lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves of righteousness for holiness. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness." If you're a slave of sin, righteousness is not your master. You do what you want. You worship the God you want to worship. You go see the movies you want to worship. You watch whatever you want on YouTube you want to. You listen to whatever you want to on Spotify. You're a slave of sin, and sin doesn't really care. You're not a slave of righteousness. You don't have to obey it. But then it says in verse 21, "What fruit did you have then in the things of which you're now ashamed? Now you know better." It says the end of those things is death, and you know it. You know it now. You know what the end of that slavery is. Verse 22, "But now, having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness, and the end, everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord." This is the struggle. The freedom of the world is actually slavery, but being enslaved to God is the actual freedom. Now, why does all of this matter? Oh, we got to get freedom right. I'm not even an American. Why do I really care? It matters because our eternal destiny as children of God is wrapped up in what we choose to do with our freedom. The liberty that we actually have becomes one of God's best instruments for understanding what we will do in the family of God. Consider, we won't turn there for the sake of time, but how free is God to do everything he wants to do? Everything he wants to do. The Bible says he is incredibly free. You might note Isaiah 46. That's where it says, he has to call a man from a far country, call a bird of prey. He just does it. He says it's going to happen, and he makes sure it happens. It's Isaiah 46, verses 9 and 10. How free is God? Here's another reference from Numbers 23. Don't turn there. I'm just going to read it. Numbers 23. It says of God, "Has he said and will not do? Or has he spoken and will not make it good?" If God says he's going to do something, he always does it. He's not restricted. He is the definition of an unfettered person in that regard, because everything he desires to achieve, he can actually achieve. None of us can say that. I appreciate the way Mr. Phil Senna said it once at a feast. He was saying, I can't even guarantee I can get to my kid's football game on time. That's how free we are. I don't even know if I'm going to make it. If God says I'm going to be there on time, he's always on time. He achieves all that he desires. Even making us. God isn't some kind of weird Star Trek sci-fi fantasy God that needed us to exist. Otherwise, without people to worship him, he would shrink away to nothing. That's nonsense. James chapter 1 says very plainly, of his own will, he brought us forth. He created us as a sort of first fruits of his creatures. God has free will. He is the freest entity in the universe. And yet, it may seem contradictory, but I highlight that it's not when you understand real freedom. In one ways, he is also the most perfectly constrained. Why? Because we have other verses, for instance, Titus chapter 1 and verse 2. Again, note it for the sake of time. We won't turn there. But it says, God cannot lie. Now, people get so caught up in things of free will, and man, that is philosophical talk that's great over a mocha at Starbucks, right? Let's put it this way. Is God ever going to lie? No, he's not. God will never lie. And so we debate about that. What is that? People say, well, does God actually have free will? Could he choose to lie? Okay, now we're making weird conditions. God will never choose to lie. His character is perfect. Let me ask you this. Let's say it's not God. Let's say it's a nice older man in the church who has been in the church. He was reared in the church. He's been baptized, and he has been baptized and had God's Spirit in him for maybe even 70 years. And let's say there are parts of his character, not fully, none of us are perfected until it's finished, but let's just fantasize that some parts of his character absolutely are sure. Let's say God knows, like he did with Abraham, you can tempt my servant so-and-so, he will never cheat on his wife. He will never cheat. I know. He's proven, he's tested, that part has been perfected, that will never happen. Let's call him Mr. Ceiling Wall. I got to give him a name. So, Mr. Ceiling Wall will never do that. Do we sit around going, oh no, poor Mr. Ceiling Wall has lost free will. Oh, it's too bad. No, he's going to freely choose not to cheat on his wife for the rest of his life. He actually has free will in that regard because nothing could ever force him to violate that principle. He no longer will ever desire to do that. Why does free will have to be defined by randomness and unpredictability? You know, as the freest will in the universe, God the Father and Jesus Christ. You know who you can also count on to do the right thing every single time without fail? God the Father and Jesus Christ. Don't get confused by philosophers that don't care about the truth. It's just silly. It's just silly talk. Why will God not sin? Let's turn to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. One of these statements that says God cannot do something. Oh no, God cannot do something. He won't because his character is perfect and he will never, ever, ever do it. It's what he desires to make of us. James chapter 1 and verse 13. It says here in James chapter 1 and verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Well, then how does temptation happen? It helps to understand how God cannot do this by seeing what temptation is. Verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. God does not desire any evil whatsoever. He desires the good. He desires the right. And so God, in that sense, and Jesus Christ are the pinnacle of actual freedom and liberty, because nothing can pull them away from their convictions, and all their convictions are not to sin. So here's the thing. God wants to know what we're going to do with freedom. There's so many verses I could turn to, and I have not given myself enough time. So let me refer to one and only turn to one more, and then we'll wrap up. I will refer to some that are familiar to a lot of us. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 23, for instance. And then also a parallel verse in the same letter, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse They can't both be right. Verse 23, I should know that. 1 Corinthians 10, 23 and 1 Corinthians 6, 23. Okay, now I should turn to them because I'm not sure both those verses are right. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 23. I've read these so many times. Why are they suspect? Oh, it's going to be right. I'm going to feel dumb. 1 Corinthians 6, 23. Aha, there's no 1 Corinthians 6, 23. Yay, I feel a lot better about my hesitancy there. It's 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12. Sorry, 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 12. It's where Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. And he didn't mean truly all things. I can kill my mother or father. It's all lawful for me. That's not what he was saying. He was speaking to an attitude they had, where they were looking at the law and considering themselves to be only restricted by it and not to set any other goals. And when we look at the law as the only restriction, then we start getting legislative-y. We start figuring out in this minute detail what we can get away with, and we miss the point of seeking God's mind. In fact, it says there at the first part, all things might be lawful that they were considering, but not all things are helpful. Paul is trying to help them raise themselves above an attitude of legalism about the law, not saying we should disobey the law. We must obey the law. But if that's where we stop, we've failed to see the mind of God. If we say things like, well, it's not a sin, so I'm just going to go ahead and do it, we've missed the point. We're not trying to be Jesus Christ anymore. We're trying to be good Americans. They have decided, well, I'm free to do this, so I'm just going to do it. Jesus Christ actually addresses that explicitly in the last passage we'll look at that Mr. Weston just mentioned in his telecast. Luke chapter 17. Oh, this passage used to bother me a little bit until it really sank in. Luke 17, starting in verse 7. I used to want to call it, well, the name of this particular story here is The Master Who's a Jerk. Is the way it seemed to me. You should be thankful and grateful. This guy's feeding you and taking care of you. But it wasn't Jesus' point, and therefore I can't make it my point. He had a different point. Luke 17 and verse 7. He says, and which of you, having a servant plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he is come in from the field, come at once and sit down to eat? Servant, I bet you're hungry. You've been working really hard on my flocks. I really appreciate that. He says, no, verse 8. Will he not rather say to him, prepare something for my supper, and gird yourself and serve me until I've eaten and drunk, and afterward you will eat and drink? In other words, be the servant. So verse 9. Does he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I think not. Now, if you just stop there, it was easy for me to think, well, Jesus' point is you shouldn't be a jerk to the people you're in charge of, right? If they're serving you, you should thank them, etc. And that was not Jesus' point. Jesus in this is not here to condemn the master. He's here to condemn the servant. Because what he says in verse 10, so likewise you, when you have done all those things which you are commanded, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done what was our duty to do. We so want to praise the people who just do their duty. He did his duty. He did his duty. And Jesus Christ is plainly saying, that's not what God is looking for. That's a good start. But don't just look at what you're bound to do and bound to avoid, but seek the mind. The servant needs to not only seek the master's restrictions, but also his very mind, to go above and beyond, to think, what is the best way I can serve my master, even in the things he has not commanded me? And the attitude that says, well, is it sin or not sin? Because if it's not sin, I'm free to do it, and I'm going to do it. I can get into debt. I can do all sorts of things because there's nothing, you can't point something in the Bible that says don't do that. Well, if we're restricting ourselves to the minimum of what God says do and not do, and not trying to think further, well, Jesus Christ says to us, you're an unprofitable servant. Congratulations, you stopped at what was your duty to do. Real freedom is seeking the mind that's greater than that, seeking the mind of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ didn't look at the minimum of what God needed of him. He sought to go the whole measure. And that's why I want us to understand freedom, because where we have liberty, God is watching us to see what we will do with it. We teach God by what we choose to do in those areas where we have freedom to choose. If when we're doing all the things we have to do, that doesn't tell him as much as what it tells him when we have flexibility and freedom in an American sense, and we make other choices. Think about what God Almighty and his Son did with their freedom. They enjoyed each other for eternity past. They were the fullness of love. They didn't have to make all of us. And they actually changed their own eternity to do what? To create the entire universe. And not even to just make it utilitarian, to make it beautiful and wonderful, because they had a plan, because they enjoyed their lives to such an extent they wanted to expand their family to billions who would be just like them. What they chose to do with their freedom was to create and to beautify and to love. They didn't have to, but they chose to do that. Well, they long to expand to us the fullness of freedom that they enjoy. And they want to know from each of us, what will we do with that freedom? And we show them what we'll do by how we treat our freedoms today.